Hello everyone, you're on my channel where you'll find forbidden BL stories. This is the story of an Omega who's sent to a re-education prison on trumped-up charges, but is rescued by the Alpha Warden himself, not into a cell, but into a private room in his block, and into a deal that sounds like freedom but feels like a trap, release in exchange for becoming his secret spouse. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you won't miss new forbidden BL stories. And write in the comments what city you're watching from. Evan knew the verdict before the judge spoke it because the courtroom smelled like certainty. Not justice, not doubt, certainty. It clung to the varnished wood, to the polished badges, to the soft rustle of tailored suits shifting in their seats. Even the air felt rehearsed, as if the room had practiced this moment 100 times and finally decided to perform it again with a new name. He sat at the defense table with his hands folded tight, knuckles pale, trying to keep his scent flat. Cheap suppressants dulled the sharp edges of his heat, but they also knotted his stomach and left a bitter film on his tongue. He had learned to live that way, quiet, careful, controlled. He worked logistics at a shipping hub where the night shift swallowed faces and the fluorescent lights made everyone look equally exhausted. He kept his head down, kept receipts, kept distance, no bonding contracts, no promises. It still took only one anonymous report. The random audit arrived at his workplace like a fire drill. Men with clipped voices asked for access logs, shipment manifests, security footage. They did not look at him. They looked through him, already holding the version of him they needed. A sealed folder appeared with his name printed on the tab, and the paper inside was almost elegant in its simplicity. Misrouted inventory, a missing crate, a signature that looked like his if you wanted it to. A timeline so clean it felt manufactured. His supervisor avoided his eyes. Human resources spoke in soft corporate language, the kind meant to sound kind while cutting you loose. By the end of the shift, Evan's badge was deactivated, and 2 security guards walked him to the door as if he might steal the air on his way out. He went home and stared at his hands, trying to remember the last ordinary thing he had done before his life turned into an accusation. I didn't do this. The thought rose, hot and useless. In court, the evidence was presented like a finished puzzle. The prosecutor spoke with the calm confidence of someone reading lines already approved. Evan's public defender flipped through pages, pen hovering, then stopping as if the ink had run out of courage. A witness testified from behind glass, voice distorted, anonymous for safety. The judge nodded at the right moments, as though he had been trained to recognize guilt by rhythm rather than fact. Evan's Omega status never appeared in the formal charge, but it lingered in the subtext, in the way the room's attention weighed on his body. When he swallowed, he felt eyes follow the motion. When his suppressants faltered for a second and a faint sweetness slipped into the air, a guard's nostrils flared and his gaze turned colder. Evan pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth and forced his breathing slow. He could not afford to be anything but contained. He tried to anchor himself on small, ordinary things. The weight of his apartment key in his pocket, the memory of his kitchen sink, chipped at the edge, the sound of delivery trucks backing into the bay at dawn, proof that he had once belonged to a normal life. Then the judge leaned forward, and the room went still. The sentence wasn't framed as punishment, it was framed as correction, a re-education term at Harrogate Institute, an Omega facility with a name that sounded like a school and operated like a warning. The judge spoke about rehabilitation, about structure, about giving Evan a chance to become functional again. The word functional landed like an insult wrapped in policy. No. It almost escaped him. He swallowed it back, tasting metal. The gavel fell, and something inside Evan went quiet, not from acceptance, but from shock. Paperwork slid across the table. A cuff clicked around his wrist with practiced gentleness that felt worse than cruelty. The courtroom began to move again. Chairs scraping, murmurs rising, people standing to resume their lives. Outside, the air was cold and bright, the kind that should have meant beginnings. Evan was guided into a transport van with other Omegas, each one holding their body like it could be folded smaller, like invisibility, might still work. The doors shut with a final hollow sound. Through tinted glass, the city blurred into color and distance, and the future narrowed into a single road leading somewhere people stopped using first names. The ride to Harrogate was not long, but it was engineered to feel like a sentence all by itself. The transport van had windows, technically, yet the glass was treated until daylight became nothing more than a pale smear. Evan could see motion without detail, as if the world outside had been reduced to a rumor. There were no clocks, no screens, nothing to measure time except the slow creep of panic and the way his legs began to cramp from sitting too still. The interior smelled of disinfectant and old restraint straps. Metal benches ran along the sides, cold even through fabric. Each Omega wore the same blank wristband printed with a number and a barcode, the first step in becoming less than a person. Evan kept his hands clasped tight in his lap, fingers interlocked so hard his knuckles throbbed. He focused on breathing, on flattening his scent the way he had practiced for years. Inhale, count, exhale, count. The cheap suppressant sat heavy in his stomach, twisting nausea into a constant undertone. He feared vomiting more than pain. Vomiting would be visible. Vulnerability always became entertainment in places that ran on control. The guards did not shout. They did not taunt. They did not have to. Silence did the work better than cruelty because it forced the mind to fill the gaps with whatever it feared most. A guard sat near the door with his baton across his knees, gaze fixed forward like a statue. Another watched the aisle without expression, eyes drifting over the Omegas as if checking inventory. No one spoke above a whisper, and even the whispers were rare. Sound felt dangerous. Attention felt dangerous. Evan stole brief, careful glances at the others. A young Omega with chapped lips stared at the floor, mouth moving as if silently reciting something to stay anchored. An older Omega held his forearm with both hands, rubbing the skin until it went red, a self-soothing motion that looked like it had been repeated for years. Someone in the back had a faint bruise near the jawline, yellowing at the edges, old enough to be ignored by official paperwork. Every face carried the same controlled tightness, the same attempt to become smaller without disappearing completely. They all knew the stories. Harrogate was clean, regulated, professional. A facility with glossy brochures and perfect safety statistics. The kind of place politicians toured for photographs, smiling with their hands on a warden's shoulder, praising progress and structure. Evan had read the public reports in the weeks between his arrest and trial because knowledge had always been his last defense. Behavioral programs, reintegration protocols, hormone stabilization, social compliance. The language was soft, rounded, designed to make discomfort sound therapeutic. But there were other stories, the ones you only heard through side channels and late-night messages. Stories told fast in half sentences, then deleted. Omegas who came out quieter, eyes dulled like lamps turned down. Omegas who did not come out at all, reclassified as transferred, relocated, unfit for release. Rumors of a wing that did not exist on maps, of special sessions that could be explained away as medical necessity. Evan had never known what to believe, but he had known enough to fear the word re-education like it was a threat disguised as help. The van turned, and the motion shifted through Evan's body like a warning. He felt his pulse in his throat. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth, forcing his breathing steady. It did not matter. His body still reacted like an animal approaching a trap it had seen in dreams. When the gates finally rose into view, Harrogate looked almost beautiful in a brutal way. High fencing glittered in sunlight like wire jewelry, elegant if you forgot what it was meant to keep in. Concrete lines were so straight they felt angry, as if the building had been designed by someone who hated softness. Cameras sat at every corner, their lenses turning as the van approached, following it with the quiet patience of predators that did not need to hurry. Someone near Evan whispered, barely audible, "This can't be real." Evan swallowed. His mouth tasted dry and metallic. He wanted to believe that truth would matter, that appeals worked, that paperwork could undo what paperwork had done. He wanted to imagine his life snapping back into place if he waited long enough. Instead, the van rolled forward, tires crunching gravel, and the gates closed behind them with a sound that felt like a lock clicking inside his chest. The yard inside was too orderly. painted lines, marked zones, guards positioned at measured intervals. Even the air seemed managed, stripped of randomness. Evan's gaze caught on small details. His mind filed automatically. The camera angles, the blind spots that were not supposed to exist, the way the staff moved with synchronized efficiency, like everyone had been trained to perform calm. The van stopped. The back doors opened. Light poured in, too bright, too exposed. Omegas were guided down one by one, not shoved, not beaten, simply directed with hands that did not linger, but also did not allow choice. Evan stepped onto the pavement, and for a second, the outside air felt unreal against his skin, cold and sharp. He tightened his coat and tried not to flinch when a guard's hand touched his elbow. Intake began immediately, efficient as a factory line. A corridor led into fluorescent brightness. Signs on the walls used gentle words for harsh things. Processing, assessment, orientation. Evan heard the hum of machines and the soft beep of scanners. They stripped the past in layers, personal items into bins, names into databases, bodies into measurements. A medic checked his blockers, noted the dosage, tapped a tablet without meeting his eyes. A clerk scanned fingerprints and moved on, already reaching for the next wrist. Evan stood in line with the others, waiting for the moment when the gates inside the gates would swallow him. He kept his shoulders squared, face neutral, scent controlled, survival posture. The kind you adopted when dignity was the only thing you could still defend. Then the line stopped. Not because a guard barked an order, not because a machine jammed. The movement halted the way a room halts when something heavy enters it. The staff's voices dropped. A guard straightened. Even the air seemed to pull taut. Someone walked into the intake hall, and the entire place changed shape around his presence. Warden Adrian Kessler entered the intake hall as if the building had been waiting for him. He was younger than Evan expected, which made him more unsettling, not less. Youth in positions like this usually meant one of two things. Either someone had climbed by being ruthless, or someone had been placed there to be controlled. Adrian's uniform was immaculate in a way that felt deliberate, every seam sharp, every button aligned. His posture was calm but not relaxed, the kind of stillness that came from discipline rather than comfort. His scent hit the room a second after he did. Not aggressive, not flooded, just present, carrying that particular alpha gravity that made bodies respond before minds could argue. Guards straightened as if their spines were pulled upward by invisible strings. The medic at the screening table lowered her voice mid-sentence. The clerk's fingers paused over the keyboard, hovering like a bird that suddenly sensed a predator overhead. Evan felt the shift in the air and hated that his body felt it too. He forced his shoulders to stay level, forced his breathing slow. He had spent years training himself to be uninteresting. He had been good at it. He had survived by becoming background noise. But in this room, with wristbands and scanners and the smell of bleach, even invisibility felt like a flimsy costume. Adrian did not scan the hall like a man hunting. He scanned it like a man verifying data. His gaze moved from clipboard to face, from file to body, measuring, cross-checking. There was no obvious emotion in his expression, no warm curiosity, no disdain, only focus. He looked at the line of omegas as if each one was a variable in a system he understood too well. Then his eyes reached Evan. The look held a fraction longer than it should have, just long enough for Evan to feel it like a hand placed at the back of his neck, not touching, but controlling the direction his head wanted to turn. Evan's suppressants kept his scent muted, yet his heartbeat still spiked, and he had to swallow to keep panic from breaking through as sweetness. He told himself the warden was only doing his job. He told himself he was just another number in a line. But Adrian's gaze returned to Evan once more, quick and precise, like a confirmation. A guard behind Evan grew impatient and stepped forward, ready to shove the line back into motion. Adrian lifted a hand, barely a gesture, fingers raised as if calling for a pause in a meeting. The guard froze instantly. No argument, no delay. The power in that small movement was quieter than shouting and far more absolute. Evan's file was pulled from the stack. A staff member opened it, exposing pages Evan had never been allowed to see. Adrian leaned in, eyes narrowing slightly as he read. He glanced from the paper to Evan, then back again. The pause was not dramatic. It was surgical, as if he were cutting along an invisible seam. Evan felt cold under his skin. Being singled out in places like this rarely meant something good. It meant someone had decided you were useful. It meant your body had acquired a new label. What did I do now? Slipped out of him before he could stop it, thin and bitter. No one answered. The staff member simply reached for Evan's wrist and checked the barcode, then nodded once. A second guard moved to Evan's side, not gripping, just positioning him like an object that needed to be relocated. Evan's legs moved on instinct, because the alternative was to make a scene, and scenes were punished in institutions that ran on order. He was removed from the line without explanation, not dragged, not shoved, simply escorted with a politeness that made his stomach tighten. The other Omegas watched him with a mix of pity and relief, as if his removal meant one less target among them. Evan kept his face blank, but inside his ribs, fear tightened into a hard knot. They led him through corridors that smelled like bleach and control. Doors passed by with silent locks and small windows that showed nothing but sterile interiors. Cameras followed his movement with smooth, mechanical patience. The farther they went, the quieter it became, until the noise of intake felt like something happening in another world. A stairwell appeared that did not match the rest of the facility. Cleaner, quieter, paint unscuffed, the air cooler, filtered. It felt private in the way wealth felt private, protected from contact. Evan's footsteps sounded too loud, and the echo made him feel exposed. At the top of the stairs was an office with thick glass and a view over the compound like a command center. From there, Harrogate looked almost orderly, like a place that could be photographed and praised. Evan hated the perspective. It made the people in the yard look small. Adrian stood by the desk, not sitting, not inviting comfort. He did not offer Evan a chair. He didn't need to. The room itself was designed to make people feel smaller without a single word. A printer hummed softly. A wristband lay on the desk, already prepared. Evan saw his number on it, black text on white plastic. The moment hit him harder than the cuff had. His name had been replaced. His story had been condensed into code. And still, Adrian said his first name. Evan's breath caught. It was such a small thing, almost nothing. But it cracked the official reality for a second, like a fingertip pressed against glass. Evan had not heard his name spoken with neutrality since the courtroom. Adrian's voice remained controlled, stripped of sentiment. He laid out the offer as if reading a report. Not a cell, not the General Omega Wing, not the programs. A separate room in the warden's block, safety, medical care, a shortened term, a sealed review of his case. Words that should have sounded like mercy, and yet landed like a different kind of chain. Evan's throat went dry. His mind raced through options and found none that felt clean. Refuse and be sent back into the conveyor belt. Accept and step into a private arrangement that would never be equal. "What do you want from me?" he asked, the fear in it sharpened by anger he could barely afford. Adrian did not soften. He did not pretend this was charity. He simply stated the price. In exchange for protection and an accelerated path to release, Evan would become Adrian Kessler's secret spouse. The word spouse hit Evan like a sudden drop in temperature. It carried meanings that institutions loved: ownership dressed as stability, control disguised as care. Evan stared at the wristband on the desk and understood that his life had just split into two futures, both of them terrifying. One was the general wing, the other was Adrian's block. Neither one was freedom. Not yet. The room Adrian gave him was too normal to be safe. That was the first thing Evan understood, even before he crossed the threshold. Normality in Harrogate was not comfort, it was strategy. A real bed waited inside, neatly made, sheets tucked with clinical precision. A small bathroom sat behind a half-closed door, stocked with unscented soap and a towel folded as if it had never been touched. A desk with a lamp stood against the wall, its surface empty except for a plain notepad and a pen placed at a right angle, like someone had arranged the scene to suggest choice. Evan paused just inside and looked for the bars. There were none. The window was wide, the glass clear enough to show the yard below. For a heartbeat, the view felt like freedom. Then he noticed the thickness of the pane, the subtle metal seam around it, the way the frame blended into reinforced concrete. The glass did not invite escape. It announced that escape had been accounted for. The door clicked shut behind him. Not a slam, not a threat, just the soft, final sound of something that did not need to raise its voice. Evan's fingers moved automatically, testing the handle, feeling the resistance. It locked from the inside, which was supposed to feel like dignity. Instead, it felt like a trick, a way of handing him a small illusion of control while the real locks remained elsewhere. He sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make his mind accept what his body already knew. This was still a prison. It was simply a prettier one. The air smelled cleaner here, filtered, lacking the sharp undertone of overcrowded corridors. The silence was different too, not the chaotic hush of people afraid to speak, but a curated quiet that pressed on the ears like thick fabric. Evan's skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. He could not see cameras, but he could feel their existence the way he felt the weight of his wristband, invisible until he remembered it, then impossible to ignore. He imagined Adrian's office above, the monitors, the angles, the recorded proof that Evan remained exactly where he was supposed to remain. Safety and surveillance folded into the same word. A knock came later, soft enough to be polite. A staff member entered, eyes lowered, movements efficient. They delivered a box with clothing that did not match standard inmate uniforms, plain and soft, as if the fabric itself was part of the deal. Another box held medical supplies, stabilizers, suppressants with proper labels, vitamins, a small device for checking basic vitals. Evan stared at it all, throat tightening. He had lived on bargain blockers that made his stomach twist and his head pound. Now expensive care sat in his room like an offering. It should have felt like relief. It felt like a price tag. Adrian's terms echoed in Evan's mind with the crispness of legal language. Evan would not be touched against his will. Evan would not be forced into a bond. Evan would be shielded from Harrowgate's programs. The promises were all built around boundaries, yet each boundary also defined a perimeter. Inside that perimeter, Evan would live under Adrian's authority. Outside it, he would return to the conveyor belt. In return, Evan would play a role. A spouse kept off record, hidden from oversight, present when necessary, invisible when required. A quiet figure who could be produced like evidence if the board demanded proof of stability. A leverage point in Adrian's larger game, whatever that game was. Evan pictured himself standing in a hallway beside the warden, silent and compliant, while men in suits nodded with approval at a story they wanted to believe. He imagined his existence becoming a prop. No. The word came out of him in a whisper, raw and small. It felt ridiculous against the room's calm. He stood and paced, 2 steps to the desk, 2 steps back to the bed, like an animal measuring the boundaries of a new cage. His pulse would not settle. His thoughts turned in tight circles. Refuse. Go back. Take the Omega wing. Keep what little integrity he had left. But then his mind pulled up the intake hall again, the line of Omegas moving like scheduled bodies, the way guards looked through them as if they were tools, the way re-education was spoken with a smile so practiced it felt rehearsed in front of a mirror. He remembered how quickly his life had been turned into a file number, how clean the false evidence had looked, how fast the judge had spoken the word correction, as if that word could justify anything done to an Omega. He walked to the window and stared down at the yard. Omegas moved in lines, not running, not speaking, simply walking where they were told. Their shoulders were slightly rounded, their hands held close, their bodies trained to occupy as little space as possible. Evan recognized the posture. He had worn it for years in the outside world, believing it was enough to keep him safe. Here it looked like a uniform. He also remembered a smaller detail, one that had only now begun to matter. The way Adrian had looked at his file. Not with surprise, not with the usual contempt, with recognition. Like he had seen this pattern before, like Evan's manufactured guilt fit into a larger system Adrian understood. That recognition frightened Evan more than cruelty would have because it suggested Adrian was not acting on impulse. He was acting with intent. Evan sank back onto the bed, hands shaking. He didn't agree because he trusted Adrian. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. He agreed because survival sometimes looked like choosing the least sharp blade, because there were worse rooms than this one, and he had already seen their doors. Later, when the lights dimmed on a schedule he did not control, Evan lay in clean sheets and listened. the distant clank of metal doors, heavy steps in corridors he could not enter, a muffled announcement that sounded gentle but carried authority. Somewhere far below, a faint shout cut off too quickly. Evan stared at the ceiling until his eyes burned, and the truth settled into him like cold water. His freedom had been replaced by a different kind of captivity, one with a lock he could not pretend did not exist. The next days were not romantic. They were procedural, the way institutions preferred everything to be. Evan woke up to a schedule slid under his door at the same hour each morning, printed in neat blocks that made time feel like property. There were slots for medical checks, meals, permitted walks, mandatory wellness assessments, and a line marked simply as observation, as if being watched required its own appointment. A nurse arrived on the first day with a small case and a calm face that did not invite conversation. She checked Evan's vitals, scanned his wristband, confirmed suppressants, and replaced his cheap stomach-knotting blockers with a clinical regimen that worked cleanly and quietly. The relief was physical and immediate. His head felt clearer. The constant nausea eased. That should have felt like kindness. Instead, it felt like a reminder that his body was now being maintained as part of an agreement, like equipment under warranty. Clothing came next. Not a uniform, not the gray fabric he had seen on the Omegas in the yard, but plain garments without markings, soft and neutral, designed to look like a private resident rather than a prisoner. Evan held the folded fabric in his hands and felt the wrongness of it. The material smelled of detergent and money, and he realized appearance was part of the deal. He was being dressed for a role. The rules arrived like choreography, taught in small, controlled pieces. A discreet staff member guided him through the private block's corridors once, then again, pointing out invisible borders, where he could stand if an inspection occurred, which doorways were safe to be seen in, and which would raise questions. The exact posture that suggested calm rather than defiance, how to keep his gaze lowered without looking broken, how to keep his scent stable in a building full of alphas without triggering either aggression or curiosity. It was the kind of training that did not call itself training. No one said obey. They said protocol. They said safety. They said discretion. But the meaning was the same. Evan learned quickly that the spouse role was not about affection. It was about optics, leverage, survival in a place that devoured weakness and recorded every irregularity. The private block had fewer cameras visible, but Evan felt more watched, not less. Here, being noticed was not a risk. It was the point. He was meant to be seen at the right moments and unseen at the right moments, like a carefully placed piece on a board. Adrian did not hover, but he did not disappear. He checked in the way a man checked gauges on a fragile system he could not afford to let fail. Sometimes it was as small as a pause in the corridor, his eyes assessing Evan's posture, the steadiness of his breath, the control of his scent. Sometimes it was the quiet adjustment of the schedule, as if Adrian had noticed which hours made Evan's nerves spike. The attention was not tender. It was precise. Evan hated that precision because it felt like ownership without touch. On the third day, a staff member arrived with documents. No ornate paper, no ceremonial language, nothing resembling marriage in any legal world Evan understood. These were internal authorizations, signed and stamped, formatted to look harmless, protected dependent status, medical exemptions, private housing allocation, confidentiality clauses that sounded like patient privacy but functioned like silence. Evan read every line twice, fingers trembling, and found the trap not in what was written, but in what was implied. He would be shielded, but he would also be contained. He would have access, but only through Adrian. "This is still a cage," Evan whispered to himself, voice barely audible in the quiet room. He signed anyway. The pen felt heavier than it should have. As the days passed, Evan began to understand why Adrian needed him in the first place. Harrogate was supervised by a board that demanded results with clean numbers and smooth narratives, corrected omegas, reduced incidents, improved compliance. A warden who appeared too soft risked being replaced. A warden who appeared too hard risked investigation. The institution needed cruelty disguised as care, and the board needed a leader who could deliver it without visible stains. A private omega in the warden's block, presented as a spouse rather than an inmate, created a convenient story. Stability, restraint, humane management. a loophole that could soothe auditors while allowing Adrian to move through the facility's shadowed machinery with less resistance. Evan, positioned as a quiet domestic detail, could become proof that Adrian's block was different, controlled, safe. Evan hated how clever it was. He hated that it worked even more. The longer he stayed, the more he felt the facility's attention shifting around him. Guards who had never looked twice at him now watched him with careful curiosity, as if trying to decide whether he was privileged or vulnerable. Staff members spoke softer when he passed, not out of respect, but out of calculation. He began to sense that his presence made the private block feel like a rumor made real, and rumors attracted hunger. At night, Evan sat at the desk and wrote down everything he remembered about his case because he refused to let his identity be swallowed by Harrowgate's narrative. He wrote names, locations, procedures, the exact phrasing the prosecutor had used, the time of day the audit team had arrived at the shipping hub. He forced himself to spell out dates in words, to anchor them in memory with the stubbornness of someone refusing erasure. The notepad filled with tight lines of ink, a private rebellion hidden in a room that belonged to someone else. Sometimes, in the quietest hours, Evan pressed a palm to his stomach out of old habit. It was a reflex from earlier years when hunger had lived in his ribs and fear had lived in his skin. He was not pregnant. There was no child to protect. But the gesture reminded him of something fundamental. His body had been a battleground long before Harrowgate, long before Adrian, long before a secret spouse contract dressed in protocol. He was not here to be saved by a powerful alpha. He was here to survive long enough to save himself. And still, he could not stop noticing that Adrian's version of power was different from the men Evan had known before. Less possessive, more controlled, dangerous in a new way, because it did not need cruelty to make obedience happen. It could achieve the same outcome with calm authority and perfectly drafted paperwork. That realization unsettled Evan more than anger did, because anger could be fought, cruelty could be anticipated, but a cage lined with softness was harder to recognize as a cage until the door clicked shut behind you and you realized you had stopped asking where the key was. Evan's room was safer than most places inside Harrowgate, but it was not separate from reality. Safety in a facility like this was never a wall. It was a thin layer, like paint over concrete. Every time he stepped into the corridor under escort, he caught fragments of the institution's true rhythm, and each fragment lodged under his skin. He saw omegas lining up for evaluation with the same disciplined posture he had already learned to recognize. Shoulders rounded just enough to look compliant, hands held close to the body, eyes trained on the floor. They moved in quiet clusters, guided by staff who spoke in soft tones that sounded almost kind, until Evan noticed what happened when someone hesitated. A hand would appear at an elbow, gentle pressure applied, the body redirected without debate. It was guidance that did not allow refusal. Then he saw them returning. Some came back with their faces too still, expressions smoothed into something blank. Others came back with hands that trembled slightly, even while trying to keep still. A few avoided looking at anyone, as if eye contact might trigger punishment. The scent in the air shifted after those groups passed, a heavy mixture of suppressants and sweat, of something medicinal masking something terrified. Evan recognized the smell, because he had lived with it in smaller doses on the outside, the scent of fear disguised as control. He began noticing patterns the way someone in survival mode always did. Not big dramatic abuses that could be photographed and condemned, but small, repeatable details that built a system. Certain staff avoided cameras in specific hallways, turning their faces away or stepping into blind angles as if moving by memory. Schedules changed without explanation, posted in the morning and altered by afternoon, making it impossible for Omegas to predict anything long enough to feel stable. A medic carried extra sedation patches in an inner pocket and touched that pocket the way a person touched a weapon. A guard lingered near Omega doors, a fraction too long, not entering, just listening, as if waiting for weakness to reveal itself. None of it was blatant enough to become a headline. All of it was blatant enough to be true. Adrian did not explain Harrowgate's inner machine. He didn't lecture Evan, didn't justify, didn't confess. But he also didn't deny the undercurrent Evan could feel. There was tension in the institution's routines, like a wire pulled tight beneath the polished surface. Everything was designed to crush individuality without leaving visible bruises, harm that looked like improvement in official reports, compliance that could be charted as progress. One afternoon, Evan passed an open door and saw a room that resembled a classroom. A few Omegas sat in chairs, backs straight, eyes forward, hands resting on their knees. A screen at the front displayed calming colors and soft words about adjustment and discipline. A staff member spoke quietly, voice gentle. The scene could have been filmed and praised. Then one Omega's breathing changed. His shoulders shook once, like a suppressed sob. The staff member's tone did not change, but two guards appeared at the doorway with practiced speed. The Omega was lifted by the arms, not dragged, not hit, simply removed as if he had broken a rule of decorum. The door closed again. The lesson continued. No one turned their head. Evan's throat tightened. This is what correction looks like, he thought, and the thought tasted like rust. He started to keep track of small things. How often certain Omegas disappeared from schedules, which staff members rotated through the evaluation rooms, how the medics' carts looked heavier after sessions labeled stabilization. He wrote observations in his notepad at night, not knowing yet what he would do with them, only knowing that forgetting would be another form of cooperation. Then, one morning, Adrian's aide arrived and told Evan he would be escorted to a restricted archive room as part of his spousal privileges. The phrase was delivered with practiced neutrality, as if it meant access to a library or a private courtyard. Evan's stomach sank anyway. Nothing in Harrogate was offered without purpose. The archive room was colder than the rest of the building. The air smelled like paper and toner. Filing cabinets stood in tight rows, each drawer labeled with codes. A terminal hummed in the corner. Evan realized immediately that this was not meant for him. It was meant for administrators, auditors, people who spoke in policy language while deciding who stayed human. He was guided to a table where a stack of records waited. Adrian's presence was quiet at the edge of the room, not sitting, not hovering, simply existing like a boundary. Evan hesitated before touching the papers, as if the truth inside them might stain his hands. The documents were not dramatic. They were worse because they were ordinary. Disciplinary records with dates spelled out in full, showing incidents that had been softened or rewritten. An Omega who had experienced emotional dysregulation rather than a panic episode after isolation. A guard who had applied necessary restraint rather than bruised someone's wrist. Medical requests denied with neat signatures and polite justifications, as if refusing treatment was a scheduling issue rather than a weapon. Evan saw the edits in the margins, the subtle differences between initial reports and final versions. He saw how language was used to clean blood off the floor before anyone outside could smell it. He saw how the institution protected itself not with walls, but with wording. His own case file appeared as part of the set, tucked among intake summaries. Evan's fingers went numb. The same clean timeline, the same elegant accusations, the same manufactured certainty. But now he saw the connective tissue, referral codes, classification tags, a chain of approvals that did not belong to random chance. His fake case was not an accident. It was a method. The realization hit him like vertigo, as if the ground shifted under his feet while his body stayed still. There were systems built to funnel Omegas into Harrogate, to profit from their labor, their compliance, their silence. Re-education was not a program. It was a marketplace with paperwork. Evan's fear did not disappear. It sharpened. If he stayed silent, he would eventually be processed like the others, no matter what Adrian promised. The board could replace Adrian. The loopholes could close. The protections could vanish overnight. If he spoke, truly spoke, with evidence, he could become the spark that burned down the machine. But sparks got crushed first. That evening, as Evan returned to the private block, he noticed a small cut on Adrian's knuckle, half hidden beneath a glove. Not the mark of violence, the mark of pressure. The kind a person carried when they spent their days holding back something larger than themselves. Evan understood then that Adrian had not offered a deal because he wanted a secret spouse. He had offered it because he needed an ally inside the story Harrogate told the world, someone who could see the machinery from the inside and still remember what it meant to be a person. And Evan, against his will and better judgment, was starting to realize he might already be that ally. The inspection was announced as a routine oversight visit, the kind of event Harrogate treated like a holiday. Routine meant performance. It meant polishing the same floors that hid the same stains, fixing the same cameras that failed in the same places, rehearsing smiles until they looked natural. The announcement went out early in the morning, filtered through calm intercom tones and clipped staff briefings. Evan heard it from behind his door and felt his stomach tighten before he even understood why. Oversight was never neutral. It was either protection for the institution or a weapon against whoever had become inconvenient. By midday, the facility had changed its skin. Corridors smelled sharper, heavier with disinfectant. Staff uniforms looked newer. A few broken lights were suddenly working. Posters about rehabilitation and wellness had been retaped so their corners didn't curl. Even the air seemed different, like Harrogate had learned to hold its breath. In the general wing, Omegas were lined up in clean uniforms, arranged by height and compliance. Evan saw them from a distance through a glass partition as he was escorted down a private corridor. Their posture was obedient in a way that wasn't natural. Shoulders set, chins lowered, hands visible. A display of harmlessness. Their scents were flattened by overused suppressants that left the air tasting faintly medicinal, like a clinic pretending to be a home. A few eyes followed Evan, not with envy, but with that quiet, exhausted curiosity that asked a dangerous question. Why him? Adrian's block became a stage. Evan understood it the moment he was handed clothing that did not match the institution's palette. Not luxurious, not provocative, just normal. A sweater without prison markings, clean pants, socks that were soft instead of stiff. The fabric rested on his skin like a false promise. A nurse checked his suppressants twice, then adjusted his dose with clinical precision until his scent became a controlled neutral, neither distressed nor alluring. It felt like being erased in a different way. When Evan looked in the mirror, he almost didn't recognize the person staring back. His hair was neat. His face was cleaner. His eyes still carried the same tension, but the rest of him looked like someone who belonged in a private apartment, not a correctional facility. For a moment, grief hit him unexpectedly, sharp and quiet. This was what he could have looked like if his life had not been converted into paperwork. This is a costume, he thought, and the thought made his throat burn. Adrian did not give long instructions. He didn't have to. Evan had already learned the choreography. Calm steps, lowered gaze but not submissive, present but not seeking attention. A person who existed comfortably in the warden's private space, suggesting consent where the institution relied on coercion. Evan hated the role because it made him complicit. He hated it more because he could see how effective it would be. The board representatives arrived in a cluster of expensive fabric and controlled expressions. Their voices were warm on the surface, their eyes cold underneath. Evan heard the soft click of shoes that had never walked prison corridors for longer than a scheduled tour. He smelled faint cologne layered over alpha confidence, the kind that assumed rooms would arrange themselves around them. Evan moved through the corridor exactly as planned. He did not rush. He did not flinch. He did not look too broken, because broken Omegas raised questions. He did not look too strong, because strong Omegas made people uncomfortable. He placed himself in the narrow line between those truths, trying to remain human without looking defiant. One board member asked Adrian something in a tone that sounded curious and harmless. Another laughed quietly at a comment about progress and modern methods. Evan caught phrases as they floated by. Reduced incidents, improved outcomes, stabilized populations. The language of numbers applied to bodies. Adrian guided them through the parts of Harrogate that photographed well. Clean halls, quiet classrooms, an activity room where Omegas folded fabric into perfect rectangles, a medical station with bright lights and fresh supplies arranged like a display. Evan watched board members smile at the clean floors, watched them nod at charts that smelled like fabricated success. He watched how their gaze skimmed over Omegas without truly seeing them, as if the people were background to the institution's story. And all the while, Evan noticed what was not shown. They did not go near certain wings. They did not pass certain doors. They did not pause by the corridor, where Evan had noticed staff slipping into blind angles. Adrian's tour flowed away from the rooms where evaluation became punishment and sedation became silence. He redirected with perfect ease, turning corners a moment before a camera angle would reveal something inconvenient. He was doing it so smoothly that most people would call it professionalism. Evan called it war. At one point, the group paused near the entrance to Adrian's private block. The board members looked around with polite interest, as if touring a well-designed office. Evan stood in the background, exactly where he'd been told to stand, hands calm at his sides, breathing slow. Then, as if by accident, a board member's gaze landed on him and held. It wasn't admiration, it wasn't judgment, it was recognition, the kind that made Evan's skin go cold. The board member's eyes moved from Evan's face to his wrist, where the edge of his band was hidden under fabric, and back again. A fraction too long. A fraction too focused, like someone had seen his name before in a file where it wasn't supposed to matter. Evan's heart kicked once, hard. He kept his expression neutral, but his body betrayed him in a tiny way, a tightening around the mouth, a subtle shift of weight. The board member's eyes narrowed, almost imperceptible, then softened again into a pleasant mask. Smile, Evan told himself, but his lips refused. The inspection ended with the usual ritual. Handshakes, compliments, promises of continued oversight. Staff resumed normal movement only after the board's cars had left the gates. The building exhaled, and the disinfectant smell began to fade back into the everyday staleness of control. That night, Evan lay awake in his clean bed and listened to distant sounds of Harrogate returning to itself. Metal doors, footsteps, a muffled announcement. He stared at the ceiling and felt a new kind of fear settle into him. The performance had worked, but it had also put a spotlight on him, and in Harrogate, being seen was the first step toward being owned. The lockdown began with an alarm that did not sound like practice. Harrogate had test tones, orderly and predictable, meant to condition bodies into calm compliance. This alarm was different. It came sharp and urgent, cutting through the building with a harsh edge that made Evan's skin tighten before his mind could label it. Lights strobed in the corridor beyond his door. A red pulse, then another, washing the walls in warning. Somewhere close, heavy metal shutters dropped with a grinding sound. The soft hum of ventilation shifted pitch, as if the building had changed how it breathed. Evan stood in the middle of his room with his palms flat against the desk, fingers spread, grounding himself in the steady pressure of wood beneath his skin. He counted his breaths. In, hold, out, hold. He tried not to let fear spike his scent. He had learned the hard way that panic was not private in a place full of alphas. Panic carried, panic invited attention. Panic could turn into punishment without anyone having to name it. Outside his reinforced window, the yard moved like a disturbed hive. Guards poured into formation at angles too sharp to be routine. Omegas were pushed into lines, not guided. Evan saw a ripple of chaos traveling through bodies, shoulders jolting, heads turning, someone stumbling as if their legs had been yanked out from under them. A shout rose briefly, muffled by glass and distance, then cut off with frightening speed. Someone had resisted. Someone had screamed too loud. Someone had refused to be corrected. A facility like Harrogate could not tolerate refusal. Refusal was contagious. Refusal was proof that compliance was not natural. Evan's door remained locked, but not in the comforting way it had before, not the polite click of privacy. This was a seal. He heard it engage, heard the deeper mechanism shift. The handle did not budge. A small panel near the frame flickered once, then went dark. Cold clarity settled into him. His protection was not a principle. It was a position. It depended on Adrian staying in control of this block, staying upright in the hierarchy, staying alive in a system that removed obstacles quietly. In a lockdown, power changed hands fast. Protocols became excuses, mistakes became convenient. Evan's gaze darted to the notepad on his desk, to the pages filled with dates and names written out in full, a private record of a truth no one wanted documented. He imagined hands tearing it apart, imagined his own body moved out of this room under the label of transfer. No, he whispered, the word thin and desperate in the quiet. Minutes stretched in a way that made time feel predatory. Footsteps thundered past his door, too many, too quick. Voices rose and fell outside, clipped and urgent, then smoothed back into controlled tones as if someone remembered they were being recorded. Evan stood still, listening for Adrian's presence and hearing nothing. Then someone appeared at his door. It was a staff member, face blank, posture carefully neutral. The person's eyes did not meet the camera above the corridor. They kept their gaze slightly lowered, as if practicing innocence. Evan's body reacted before thought. His skin tightened, every nerve sharpening into focus. The wristband on the staff member's arm was wrong for this block. The color coding did not match the private wing. Evan had seen enough of Harrogate systems to understand small discrepancies were never accidental. They were permissions. They were access. The staff member's hand reached toward the panel near the door. Their fingers hovered as if ready to override the lock. Evan stepped back instinctively, heart pounding so hard he felt it behind his eyes. He imagined the door opening, imagined being escorted with polite efficiency into a corridor that would swallow him, into the general wing where Adrian's loopholes meant nothing. His mouth went dry. Not like this, he thought, a raw plea without sound. Before the panel could be activated, the corridor changed. It was subtle at first, like gravity shifting. The air thickened with a presence Evan had learned to recognize. Adrian did not arrive loudly. He did not shout. He did not run. He appeared at the edge of the hallway with the calm of a man who had decided the outcome before anyone else spoke. The staff member froze. Their hand pulled back from the panel as if it had touched something hot. Adrian's gaze landed on them, steady and flat, and whatever expression the staff member had been wearing cracked for a second into something like unease. "What are you doing?" Adrian said quietly, and the quiet was sharper than an order. The staff member tried to hold neutrality, but their shoulders shifted, the slightest sign of retreat. They murmured something too low for Evan to hear through the door, then backed away with controlled steps, as if leaving by choice rather than being dismissed. Adrian remained still until they turned the corner and disappeared. Only then did Evan's lungs release a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The lockdown continued. The building stayed sealed. Intercom announcements repeated calm instructions in a tone that did not match the urgency Evan had seen in the yard. The dissonance made his stomach twist. Harrogate was telling one story over speakers while acting out another behind closed doors. Hours later, when the alarms finally softened into lower-level alerts, Adrian opened Evan's door himself. Not fully, not wide. Just enough to allow Evan to see the corridor and the reality of armed order outside. Adrian's face was controlled, but Evan noticed the tension at his jaw, the slight tightness around his eyes. "You stay close," Adrian said, and it wasn't a suggestion. Evan followed him through a restricted passage into a secure room lined with silent monitors. The screens showed angles Evan had never been meant to see. A corridor where Omegas were forced to kneel under the label of de-escalation. A medical room where sedatives were injected while a clipboard recorded stabilization. A guard tightening restraints with the careful hands of someone doing routine work. A staff member typing, then deleting, then rewriting an incident report in real time. Evan's stomach turned. His throat tightened as if his body wanted to reject what his eyes were being forced to hold. This is what they call help, he thought, and the thought felt like poison. Adrian watched the screens without flinching, but Evan saw the cost in the small details, the way Adrian's hands stayed clasped too tightly behind his back, the way his breathing remained controlled as if any crack would be dangerous. Evan understood then what the lockdown had truly been. Not chaos, not an emergency, a staged incident designed to justify harsher measures, a perfect opportunity to move prisoners, isolate troublemakers, erase witnesses. A controlled storm. And someone had tried to include Evan in that storm, to shuffle him into the general wing where protections evaporated and accidents could happen quietly. Someone inside wanted him removed, not because he was an Omega, because he was Adrian's secret, and secrets were leverage. Evan stared at the monitors until his eyes burned, and something in him shifted. Fear was still there, heavy and real, but it no longer owned him the same way. He was not just surviving anymore, he was collecting proof. And once you held proof in a place built on silence, you either used it or you became the next person erased. The leak did not come from the outside. Evan understood that almost immediately, because outside leaks arrived like storms, loud and chaotic, with reporters sniffing at gates and questions shouted into the air. This leak arrived like a blade slid between ribs, quiet, precise, meant to injure without drawing attention to the hand that held it. It started with a shift in how the facility moved. Staff, who used to walk past Evan with neutral faces, now slowed just enough to watch him. Guards who had once avoided his gaze began to track him openly, eyes lingering as if he were a thing that could be taken. Even the corridor felt different, like the air itself had learned new rules. Evan caught the faint tightening of alpha sense around him, controlled but sharpened by interest. A rumor had weight here. It changed posture, tone, access. He heard fragments before he heard the whole story. A clipped phrase from a nurse who stopped speaking the moment he entered a doorway. A guard murmuring to another, voice low, the words not meant for Evan, but impossible to fully hide. Then, the institution's calm veneer cracked just enough for the truth to show through. The warden was harboring an Omega in his private block, not as a protected witness, not as a medical exception, as something messier and more useful to scandal. An unregistered relationship arrangement, the kind that sounded like misconduct, even if no one could prove what it truly was. The rumor moved through staff channels first, carried by people who lived on whispers. It slid into the board's inboxes next, wrapped in concern and ethical questions. Then, it reached the spaces Adrian could not control, the quiet networks where officials traded leverage like currency. The story was framed as corruption, not protection, abuse of power, a warden using a prisoner as a personal asset, a predator hidden behind policy language. It did not matter what had actually happened. Harrogate did not run on truth. It ran on narratives that served whoever held the pen. Evan felt the shift in his own body like a warning signal. His suppressants kept his scent stable, but anxiety still pressed into his ribs, still tightened his throat. He began to sense eyes on him even when corridors looked empty. He began to measure the distance between himself and locked doors, the speed of footsteps behind him, the angles where cameras did and did not see. He stopped feeling protected and started feeling contested, as if his existence had become a prize in a struggle he had never agreed to join. Adrian's behavior changed too, not dramatically, but in the way a man changed his breathing before walking into fire. Meetings extended. Security rotations in the private block tightened. Communication became shorter, more controlled, stripped of any unnecessary detail. Evan noticed how staff members now checked door panels twice, how aides carried folders closer to their chest, how every routine task suddenly carried an extra layer of caution. Pressure built like a storm behind glass. Evan could not see it directly, but he could feel it gathering in the institution's muscle memory. The board could demand an emergency audit. They could order a relocation under the excuse of appropriate inmate placement. They could remove Adrian from his position and install someone who believed Harrogate's cruelty was not an unfortunate necessity, but a virtue. And if that happened, Evan's deal would become meaningless overnight. That knowledge sat in Evan like a weight. It turned the clean room into something narrower. It made the bed feel less like a place to sleep and more like a holding area. It made every polite knock sound like a test. The night the warning arrived, the corridor was unusually quiet. No distant announcements, no footsteps dragging past his door. Evan sat at his desk under the lamp's soft light, writing down what he remembered from the archive room, forming sentences as if words could become armor. Then he heard a faint sound at the bottom of his door, a whisper of paper sliding across the floor. Evan froze. His pulse rose so fast it almost made him dizzy. He stared at the narrow gap beneath the door as if it might open on its own. For a moment he did not move, afraid that moving would confirm he had been targeted. Then he stood and crossed the room in 2 careful steps. He knelt and pulled the paper toward him, fingers trembling. It was a schedule, printed in official formatting, marked with a relocation time written out in words and a wing assignment that made Evan's stomach drop. General Omega housing, evaluation follow-up, standard integration, no signature, no explanation. It did not need either. The message was clear. You are being moved, and no one will call it violence. Evan's hands shook as he read the lines again and again. His throat tightened until swallowing hurt. He searched for any sign that it was a mistake, a clerical error, a routine shift. Then he saw the faint stamp in the corner, a code that belonged to the deputy warden's office. Evan remembered the man from inspection day, the smile that lingered too long, the scent that carried ambition under polished professionalism. He remembered the way that man's eyes had slid past Omegas like they were obstacles. Evan understood then that the leak was not only gossip, it was strategy. If the deputy warden could frame Adrian as corrupt, the board would tighten control. If Evan could be relocated into the general wing, Adrian would lose the leverage Evan represented. The quiet loophole would close. The institution's machine would keep running, cleaner than ever because it would have eliminated the one detail that made it look messy. Evan sat back on his heels, the paper crumpled slightly in his fist. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He stared at the door as if it might open at any second. "I'm not going back," he whispered, and the words sounded like a promise and a threat at the same time. He had a choice now, sharper than anything he had faced since sentencing. Run the moment a door opened, take whatever chance he could grab, and vanish into the city's shadows, where Harrogate might not be able to reach him quickly, or stay and fight, knowing that fighting meant becoming a target that could be erased. For the first time since the judge had spoken the word correction, Evan understood something with brutal clarity. Freedom was not a place outside Harrogate. Freedom was a decision no one could sign away on paper. Evan chose to stay, and the decision felt like stepping into fire on purpose. Running would have been simpler in a brutal way. It would have meant one clear goal, one clear direction, one clear fear. Staying meant living inside the beast and deciding to carve proof from its bones before it swallowed him whole. He did not announce his choice like a declaration. He carried it like a weight. He looked at the relocation schedule with the deputy warden's stamp, then at his own notepad full of written dates and names, and understood that leaving would not erase Harrogate's machinery. It would only erase him from it. The institution would keep moving, clean and quiet, feeding on the next Omega routed in by the same method that had caught Evan. The next morning he asked for access to the archive room again. Not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as necessity. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "I need the records," he said, and the simplicity of the sentence made his throat tighten. He expected Adrian to refuse, to calculate risk, to protect the block by keeping Evan ignorant. Instead, Adrian granted it, and Evan realized something had shifted between them. Evan was no longer only protected, he was trusted. They worked like survivors who understood that truth had to be built, not claimed, piece by piece, with relentless attention that bordered on obsession. Evan learned how Harrogate's paperwork breathed, how it inhaled raw events and exhaled sanitized language. He compared edited incident reports with camera timestamps that still carried their original metadata. He matched medical logs against supply deliveries, watching how the facility ordered sedation patches in quantities that did not align with the official number of stabilization events. He aligned disciplinary actions with board meeting dates and saw spikes appear like bruises, concentrated and intentional, as if Harrogate tightened its grip whenever oversight approached. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. Harrogate was not correcting Omegas. It was manufacturing compliance and profiting from the process. It produced obedient bodies the way factories produced goods, and when a body broke, it was reclassified as unfit and quietly removed from statistics. Evan's own false case became part of the evidence. The more he dug, the more the neat timeline from court began to look like a template reused again and again. He found a signature trail that linked offices outside the facility to the men inside. A prosecutor whose career advanced in suspicious increments, each promotion timed after a successful funneling of difficult cases into re-education. A judge who owed favors to donors connected to Harrogate's board. A clerk whose specialty was losing defense documents and misfiling appeals until deadlines passed. It was not personal. That was the most frightening part. It was efficient. Evan's hands sometimes trembled over the papers. He would pause, press his fingertips to the edge of the table, and force himself to breathe. "This is real," he would whisper, not to convince anyone else, but to keep his own mind from slipping into denial. Denial was the last comfort the institution offered. The more Evan discovered, the more dangerous he became. He felt the deputy warden's response before it arrived in any official form. Staff began avoiding Evan's eyes in a way that was not fear but calculation, as if they were trying not to be associated with him. Meals arrived later than scheduled, food colder, portions slightly smaller, the kind of petty degradation that could be dismissed as oversight but felt like a message. Security rotations shifted so unfamiliar, guards appeared near the private block's boundary, standing in places that suggested they were not there by accident. Then a notice appeared in Evan's file. Medical evaluation, urgent, scheduled at a time that did not match the facility's normal patterns. The authorization code was wrong. It did not come from Adrian's office. Evan stared at the notice until his vision blurred. He knew what an urgent evaluation could mean here: a private room, a needle, a documented stabilization that turned an Omega quiet enough to stop being inconvenient. It could be done without bruises, without screams, without anything a board member would ever have to see. A controlled institution had 1,000 quiet ways to hurt someone without leaving visible marks. For a moment, Evan considered submitting, letting himself be moved, letting the machine swallow him rather than punish him for resisting. The thought felt like stepping toward a cliff just to stop feeling the wind. Then he remembered the yard and the lines of Omegas moving like scheduled bodies. He remembered the blank eyes returning from evaluation. He remembered the monitors in the secure room showing compliance enforced under the label of treatment. "No," he said out loud, and his voice cracked. Adrian did not respond with reassurance. He responded with action. The evaluation was canceled without drama. The staff member who delivered the notice was reassigned. The guards at the boundary were replaced. Evan watched it happen the way a person watched a shield move into place, and he understood that Adrian was burning political ground to keep him standing. In the middle of this, something else grew between them. Not soft romance, not fantasy, not the kind of intimacy that made life easy. It was steadier and more unsettling, a mutual recognition that they were now bound by risk. Adrian did not promise safety with pretty words. He proved it by placing himself between Evan and the machine, again and again, even when it cost him leverage with the board. Evan found himself watching Adrian's exhaustion with a painful kind of care. He noticed the faint shadows beneath Adrian's eyes, the way his jaw stayed tight even when he stood still, the way he sometimes stared at a screen for a beat too long before moving again. Not because Adrian was perfect, because Adrian was a man trying to dismantle a system from the inside, and systems punished people who tried. Evan had been told his whole life that Omegas survived by yielding, by folding themselves small, by disappearing before the world could decide how to use them. Now he was learning survival could also look like refusing to move when they tried to shove you, and refusal had a cost. Evan could feel that cost collecting around him like smoke, thickening day by day. The emergency hearing arrived like a guillotine, dressed as procedure. There was no dramatic announcement, no sirens, no visible panic. Harrogate did not do panic in public. It did urgency in polished language, in sealed memos, in doors that opened for some people and stayed locked for others. Evan learned about it when his schedule changed without explanation, and Adrian's aide appeared with clipped instructions and a folder carried too carefully. The board demanded answers. The deputy warden demanded control. The facility's reputation hung in the air like a threat that did not need to be spoken out loud. In a place built on narratives, reputation was not image, it was armor. Evan was not meant to be present. Prisoners were not invited to oversight meetings. Omegas were not considered reliable narrators of their own suffering. Their testimonies were labeled emotional, biased, unstable, convenient to dismiss. Harrogate thrived on that dismissal. But Adrian had built a loophole around Evan's status, a protected dependent, a private resident, a spousal arrangement that had never existed on paper outside the institution, but existed enough inside it to crack protocol. And cracks were how light entered sealed rooms. Evan walked down a corridor he had never been allowed to see before, passing doors marked administrative and restricted, hearing the different silence of power. Here, the walls were cleaner, the lighting softer, the air conditioned to comfort people who never had to sleep behind locks. He felt his own body react to the shift like it was crossing a border. His spine stayed straight because he forced it. His scent remained steady because he made it. His hands shook only slightly because he kept them clasped together until the tremor settled into his wrists. A guard opened the hearing room door. Inside, the space looked like a conference room pretending it was neutral. A long table, water glasses aligned, tablets and folders positioned like weapons laid neatly on a cloth. The board members sat with the calm faces of people who believed they were above consequence. A legal advisor in a tailored suit held a pen poised, ready to translate human damage into acceptable language. A security chief watched the room with the blank eyes of someone trained to see threats rather than people. The deputy warden stood at the far end with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Evan recognized him immediately, not because of any single feature, but because ambition had a scent. Controlled, sharp, hungry, Evan felt dozens of eyes land on him as he entered, some curious, some disgusted, some bright with the anticipation of scandal. The story they wanted was simple and satisfying. A warden abusing power with a captive Omega, a private arrangement that could be condemned without touching the institution itself. Evan understood the trap. If he looked too frightened, he would be dismissed as weak and manipulated. If he looked too composed, he would be cast as calculating. If he spoke too emotionally, they would label him unstable. If he spoke too coldly, they would call him coached. Harrogate trained people to lose before they opened their mouths. Evan walked to the indicated position, stopped, and breathed once, deep and controlled. The air tasted faintly of expensive cologne and institutional confidence. "This is my life," he thought, and the thought steadied him more than fear did. The deputy warden began with accusations, delivered in careful phrases: improper conduct, misuse of authority, an Omega held in private quarters under an unregistered relationship arrangement, ethical violations, security risks. He spoke like a man presenting a cleanup plan, not like a man describing a human being. Evan listened without moving, letting the words slide past his skin without entering. He had heard worse in court. He had heard worse in intake. When it was time for him to speak, the room waited for drama. Tears, pleading, confession, anything that could be framed as either guilt or hysteria. Evan gave them something else. He presented evidence, not emotional pleas, not a dramatic breakdown. Paper and numbers turned into a structure they could not easily dismiss. He placed documents on the table, each one labeled with dates written out in full, each one cross-referenced, each one tied to something the institution itself had recorded and failed to erase. He spoke in a controlled rhythm, the way a person spoke when their survival depended on being impossible to misquote. Incident reports, with edits visible between drafts, camera timestamps that did not match the official narrative, medical logs compared with supply deliveries, showing sedation use that exceeded the recorded need. Disciplinary spikes aligned with board visits, proving performance had a cost paid by Omega's bodies. He connected the deputy warden's authorization code to relocation orders, including the schedule slipped under Evan's door. He connected external legal contacts to Harrogate's intake pipeline, showing how certain prosecutors and clerks formed a quiet chain that funneled specific cases into re-education. He spoke of his own file not as a tragedy, but as an example of method. At one point, his voice slipped for a moment, the controlled tone cracking just enough to let the truth bleed through. "I was not sentenced to be corrected," he said, quiet but sharp. "I was sentenced to be useful." The room changed in increments, not outrage, not sudden justice, just subtle shifts that meant the narrative was slipping out of the deputy warden's hands. A board member's smile tightened. A legal advisor's pen paused mid-stroke. The security chief adjusted posture, suddenly paying attention in a different way. A medic on the oversight team lowered their gaze to the documents and stayed there longer than comfort required. The deputy warden's scent sharpened for the first time, controlled anger leaking through his professionalism. His expression remained pleasant, but Evan saw the strain at the corner of his mouth, the slight flare of nostrils as if he were smelling smoke. Adrian did not interrupt. He did not rescue Evan with authority. He stood behind him like a wall, present steady, letting Evan's voice carry the weight. That mattered. It mattered that the truth came from the Omega the institution had treated as an object. It mattered that Evan was not being spoken for. When the board members began asking questions, they aimed them at Evan first, probing for weakness, for contradictions, for anything that could be dismissed as misunderstanding. Evan answered with documents rather than feelings. Every time a question turned toward scandal, he turned it back toward method. Every time someone tried to reduce him to an arrangement, he expanded the frame until the institution itself was the subject. The hearing did not end with applause. Institutions rarely did. It ended with controlled damage control, the kind designed to preserve the building while sacrificing a few parts of its machinery. The deputy warden was suspended pending investigation. Outside auditors were assigned. Medical protocols were ordered to be reviewed. Certain staff members were quietly removed from schedules as if they had never existed. It was not justice. It was the beginning of dismantling. But in places like Harrogate, beginnings were victories. That night, back in the private block, Evan's body finally crashed from adrenaline. He sat on the floor beside his bed, breathing hard, palms pressed to his thighs as if holding himself together. His hands still shook, now with exhaustion rather than fear. He realized he had just made himself unforgettable to people who preferred Omega's invisible. He had also made it harder for the machine to pretend it was benevolent. He was still in prison, but something inside him had stepped out. Months later, Harrogate looked the same from the outside, the same concrete walls that held heat in summer and cold in winter. The same fences crowned with wire that glittered like jewelry from a distance and like a warning up close. The same cameras turning on their mounts with patient mechanical calm. Institutions loved the illusion of permanence. They relied on it. If a building looked unchanged, people assumed its cruelty was also unchangeable, as natural as weather. But inside, the air had changed. Oversight was no longer a word used for tours. It became weight. Staff moved differently, less relaxed in their private habits, more cautious about where they stood, what they said, what they signed. Medical rooms had new locks and new checklists posted where everyone could see them. Reports were still written in smooth language, but they were no longer edited as casually, no longer rewritten without a trail. The most predatory parts of the program did not vanish overnight, because rot never left without resistance, but it was cut back, exposed, forced into daylight where it could be named. Omegas were still confined. Harrogate was still Harrogate, yet the machine had lost some of its invisible teeth, and the loss mattered. Evan's release came without ceremony. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, no moment of public correction to match the private harm. Harrogate did not apologize because apology implied responsibility, and responsibility implied liability. Instead, there was paperwork. Neatly printed pages with dates written out in full, signatures stamped with official authority, phrases that reclassified his sentence, cleared his false charge, and presented his freedom as if it had always been part of the plan. A guard handed him his belongings in a plastic bag, a wallet that felt too light, keys that no longer fit any lock that mattered, a phone that had missed too many days to pretend time had paused. Evan stared at the bag in his hands and felt something strange rise in his chest, not joy, not relief, but a quiet disbelief that the gates were opening for him at all. Walking out was its own kind of fear. The corridor to the exit smelled the same as always, but Evan noticed details differently now. He noticed how the cameras followed him even as he left, as if the building needed to watch him until the last second. He noticed how the guard's posture suggested irritation, as if Evan's release was an inconvenience. He noticed the way his own steps sounded too loud, as if he was still afraid to take up space. When the outer gate finally opened and air hit his face without filters, Evan's body reacted like it did not trust it. His lungs filled too fast, his hands tightened around the bag's handles, the sky looked too wide. The world outside felt less like freedom and more like exposure. He had feared Harrogate's corridors because they were predictable in their cruelty. He feared the outside because it was unpredictable in its memory. His name had been attached to scandal and reform. Enemies still remembered. The deputy warden's network had not disappeared. It had simply learned to hide better. There would be people who wanted Evan silent, people who wanted him discredited, people who wanted his testimony to become a cautionary tale for other Omegas who might try to speak. He stepped through the final gate anyway. Adrian waited beyond it, not in uniform. That detail landed harder than any vow could have. Evan had expected Adrian to appear in controlled authority, to stand as a symbol of protection the way he had inside Harrogate. Instead, Adrian stood in plain clothing that did not carry rank, and his scent, restrained but unmistakable, held a quiet fatigue Evan recognized. It meant Adrian had paid a price, either resignation, removal, or a strategic step away from a position that would always be poisoned by Harrogate's history. It meant Adrian had chosen something that wasn't career, wasn't control, wasn't clean. It meant Adrian had chosen Evan. For a moment, Evan could not move. The space between them felt like a chasm filled with everything that had happened. The deal made in a locked office, the choreography of survival, the monitors showing what no one was meant to see, the hearing where Evan's evidence cracked the narrative. Evan's throat tightened until he could barely breathe. "This was never supposed to be real," Evan said softly, and the words sounded like a confession to the air. Adrian did not answer with promises. He stepped closer, close enough that Evan could feel the steadiness of his presence without being touched. It was an offering of space rather than pressure, the kind that asked permission without asking out loud. The secret spouse arrangement could have ended the moment Evan's file was cleared. That would have been logical, safe, convenient. The board would have preferred it. Harrogate's remaining loyalists would have preferred it. Even Evan's survival instincts would have preferred it, because intimacy after captivity could feel like another trap. But the months had built something neither of them had planned. Trust forged under pressure, a shared understanding that love did not always arrive as softness. Sometimes it arrived as someone standing between you and a machine that wanted you broken again and again until the machine had to retreat. Their relationship did not become a public spectacle. Evan refused to let it. He refused to let their lives be turned into another narrative for people to consume. Instead, it became structure. Therapy appointments that were scheduled like medicine. Legal protections filed in careful language so no one could reclassify Evan's past as instability. A quiet home far from institutional walls, chosen for privacy rather than status. Evan refused to let his survival be a one-time exception. He pushed for the foundation idea the way he had pushed for evidence, piece by piece. Funding Omega legal defense, paying for independent medical evaluations, building a network of attorneys who could not be bought as easily. Adrian's connections opened doors, but Evan's insistence gave the work its spine. He did not want gratitude. He wanted change that could outlive him. Some nights, the past still climbed into Evan's body without permission. He woke with his heartbeat too fast, tasting bleach in his memory, hearing alarms in the silence of a safe room. His hands would shake as if expecting cuffs. In those moments, Adrian did not fix him with power. Power had been part of the problem. Adrian stayed steady and present, letting Evan's nervous system learn slowly that safety could be real, that a door could remain unlocked without becoming a threat. Evan had entered Harrogate as a file number. He left it as a person who had forced the institution to remember his name. Freedom, he learned, was not the absence of walls. Freedom was being seen and still believed. Freedom was building a life that no institution could rewrite into a code on a wristband. Freedom was taking a deal that started as survival and refusing to let it end as secrecy, because secrecy belonged to the people who wanted Omega's quiet. In the first weeks outside, Evan would sometimes stand by a window and watch ordinary streetlights flicker on at dusk. The world moved in casual rhythms that had nothing to do with re-education schedules. Cars passed, people laughed, life continued with cruel indifference. Evan would press his fingers to the glass and whisper, barely audible, "I'm here." And for the first time, the words felt true.